this started off as your PhD dissertation, and then it ended up becoming a graphic novel. So one of the things I was curious about is what changed in that process? What was lost? What was gained? And why did you ultimately choose to publish it as a graphic novel?
Right, right. Yeah. So I mean, who turns their dissertation into a graphic narrative, right? I mean, that's weird. But that was not planned. It wasn't until, and so I was actively researching this and writing it over a 4-year period from 2000 to 2004. And so the book, the graphic narrative actually came out, what is that? Don't make me do math. Was that 15, 16 years after? And I really wanted to, I had left academia, and I think, yeah, that's a whole nother story about why that happened. Basically, let me just say that there are a lot of, I got fired multiple times due basically to racism. I'd be asked to specifically recruited to come teach race, and then it's like, oh, we didn't mean that. But anyway, so I decided that I was going to leave trying to be within the system of academia. But what I felt like was a really big regret for me was that I had this dissertation that I did all this work on, and then and I published in a few scholarly articles, and it was all behind like the ivy curtain. Is that a thing?
Mm-hmm.
No, the ivy, whatever the ivy curtain.
It's real. The ivy curtain's real.
Yeah, just buried in academia, and I'm sure like 5 people had read it. So I was like, okay, before I move on to who knows what's next, I want to try to get this knowledge out there and put it out in a way that wasn't in academic language. And that's when I decided to try a graphic novel. Don't love the term novel because that implies fiction, and this is nonfiction, but that's just the name for the medium. I'm trying to change it to graphic narrative, but that might be a Sisyphean task. It's just me. But
Good
anyway,
luck.
Yeah, good luck, right? But so I had no idea how to do that. I had read plenty. I've always loved that format, and I was really, I had taught Art Spiegelman's Mouse a couple times, and I read it to my son. It just got banned in some school district in Tennessee. But anyway, and so I was really inspired by that, but I had only written ever in academic formats. Like I had published a couple chapters for law school textbooks. I had, it's like, so this whole process was completely new for me. And so I decided to just take a stab in it. And, a friend connected me with Hugo Martinez, my amazing illustrator, who I was paying like a per page rate for my credit card, and then we did this little Kickstarter, and then things just blew up. And so then it became like both of our full-time jobs, I mean, it was crazy. I was like a fired teacher, and he was a full-time pedicab driver. And suddenly this is what we were doing. And it's just been nonstop ever since. It just got nominated for the NAACP Image Award. It got finalist for the PEN America Award. Actually, I have to go to New York, and they have like a ceremony that's like the Oscars of books. I'm like, what is that? Can I just like, not have the largest carbon footprint on the planet, and just, can I like call into that? Like, no, you have to be here in person. So yeah.
So I guess returning to a part of that question, I guess part of the reason I asked it, because I'm really curious, like what was lost in that project, because I bet there was a lot gained, like accessibility to more people. You were able to focus on and flesh out parts of the narrative. Like, I don't know if they'll let you go on like an imaginary journey in a PhD dissertation where you're like, this is something that might have happened, or like, a conjecture that's based on a lot of context and like historical PhD research on it. So those are the things that were most likely gained, and I bet you could name more, but like, what do you feel like was lost in the process, if anything?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a big part that I left out because I felt like it might just stultify people was this whole the whole historiography of the discipline. And if we have time, I'm happy to talk about it. I've learned now how to distill it down to like 7 sentences. And the paperback's coming out in June, and we have some sort of questions and answers at the back, including a section on historiography. That was the really big part, which just kind of answers the question of like, why is this hidden? Like, you know, how have historians written in such a way that has elided this story? And I think it's, I think there's other things that were lost, but there was so much gained. I mean, in this medium, it allows you to make a story like this accessible without reducing its complexity. So, people who are reading it are like suddenly reading about like, old British common law and all kinds of crazy things that they probably weren't expecting to be reading. But it's speaking to people. It's speaking to all kinds of people I wasn't expecting. So I can't really, I don't know that not sure that I've lost anything except for the historiography.
One of the most beautiful things about it is that it's also a commentary on just how history is written, right? Like you alluded to like the archives that you weren't allowed to enter, for example, when you were in the UK. And like that's something that is, I feel like a very powerful moment in the book where it's like, wow, there's this very important history in here. And there's these gatekeepers preventing all of us from having access to like something that's completely changed the fate of like entire humanity in the globe, right? And I feel like the book does a great job of talking about this, like, yes, almost like meta history, like, oh, how is history written? How do we have those conversations? And I guess one question that I had for you is whether you think the archive is a privilege or if it's a right. Because the way that some people were treating it in the book is like, oh, it's a privilege. Like, nobody has the right to just walk in here and take anything that's being brought up. But in the sense, I don't know, there's a part of me that's itching towards like the right direction. But I was curious on just your answer as a historian, as your relationship to this archive.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a right. And I think, but it's important to make some distinctions because the book actually talks about various archival violence. And it was different types. I think you're referring to me trying to get access to Lloyd's of London's archive. Lloyd's of London is a private company. So they aren't required to let anyone access their archive. For folks who haven't read the book, so one of the things that was a big part of this book and my research process was studying the role of women on slave ships during the Middle Passage. And Lloyd's of London actually got their start ensuring the slave trade. And they had a specific provision where, slave ship operators and owners would be insured against what was called the insurrection of cargo. I don't know what to say about that. It just speaks for itself. Anyway, but because they had this insurance policy, slave ship operators needed to carefully document any instances of revolt. And so that allowed me as a historian to have access to these stories. But I wanted to, go to Lloyd's to try to uncover more of these stories. And they were like, yeah, no. But I know a lot of other historians actually do have access to their corporate archives, but they're there researching things that are not, I guess, they don't see as threatening, and I try to tell them, like, I know they're afraid of getting sued for reparations or whatever. And I tried to tell them, I have less than no interest in that. I'm trying to actually uncover these stories and tell these stories. And it's funny because since the book came out, so it was published in the UK at the same time as it was published here, And Lloyd's of London contacted me. My wife's like, you be careful, they're going to put a hit out on you. But no. And, we're trying again. I don't know. That's a whole nother story. I don't know how that's going to go. But yeah, just so I just want to, for folks who haven't read the book, the issue about the slave trade, so the whole idea that women were involved in slave revolts at all, had been completely denied by historians, and actually still is. It's pretty pathetic. But one of the things that happens, like in the late 90s, as the internet was really taking off, these historians who studied the Atlantic slave trade combined all of their data together and created this database that had 36,000 slave trade voyages in a searchable database. And it's online right now, and anyone can use it. It's free. It's the Atlantic slave trade database. And so these historians who created it, they asked, you can query the database. This is what quantitative historians do. They like create databases and query them. God bless them. It's not the work I do. But so one of the first things they asked was, how many revolts were there on these ships? And they found that there was a revolt on 1 in 10 slave ships, which shocked everybody, because revolts on slave ships are basically an act of suicide. And so people thought it was a very rare thing. And so then they wanted to know, well, what was the difference between the ships that had revolts and the ships that didn't have revolts? And the only thing they could find that made any statistically significant difference was that the more women on the ship, the more likely there would be a revolt. And these historians immediately dismissed their own findings, saying, but we know that women weren't involved in this type of resistance. I didn't know that. And through this insurrection of cargo captains, logs, being in the UK, reading hundreds and hundreds, like the thing that's important to understand is that the slave trade was it wasn't something that happened on the down low, right? It was it was a huge business enterprise and highly regulated. And there were all kinds of like rules and laws and regulations for how ships should even be operated. And so what happened is that once the ship left the coast of Africa, before it left, everyone was below deck in chains. Once it left the coast of Africa, women were unchained and brought on deck. And that's also where the weapons were. And it also gave them mobility. So this is the answer to the question why there were more revolts on ships that, with women on them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's super important. And do you happen to know, yes, how many women-led slave revolts there were in general? And do you feel like that number, I bet it's underreported, but yes, out of those queries, did we have a ballpark figure?
Are you talking about on slave ships during the Middle Passage?
Yeah, on the Middle Passage.
Yeah, no. So that would be like a lifetime research project. It would involve going through each and every slave ship captain's log. And if I had money and a team of researchers, we could knock it out. But yeah.
Great PhD like research material.
What?
Great PhD research material.
Yeah, if you want to spend 30 years of your life writing a dissertation. But yeah, so I mean, my project was trying to prove, was against the predominant historical narrative, is that women weren't involved in any type of basically organized collective acts of violence, that women weren't involved in that. And that's something that is a strong kind of impact, that particularly on US historiography and places that became the United States. So British colonies. Studies in the Caribbean and Latin America are better at acknowledging women's participation in leadership. There's a few reasons for that, but yeah, in the United States, it was definitely just rejected.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious about those reasons. Is that
Yeah,
too
okay, let's
complicated
go
and
there.
too
Nope,
academic, or
nope,
like, is
nope,
that fair
nope.
game?
It's fair game now. I've learned over the months how to how to do this. So basically, history is always written in like a social and political context, right? It's not ever written in a vacuum. And historiography is actually the study of the writing of history. It's kind of the methodology that we learn. But this aspect of it in particular is a study, every historical research, every, historian has a perspective. They have like a viewpoint. Every history has a viewpoint. And historiography is studying the different perspectives over time. So the historiography of slave resistance, started when historians were first writing about, and I'm talking mainstream history, right? The first historians who were writing about the history of slavery and slave resistance was like, there is no history of slave resistance because there was no resistance and these are people writing turn of the 20th century who basically either had previously owned slaves or were descendants of people who had, and there, the history at the time was slavery was a benign institution. It had a civilizing effect on Black people. Everyone was happy with it and there was no resistance. And that was how history was taught until like the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And you get like a shift in the mainstream historiography with, more African Americans getting in the academy, more sort of progressive historians in general. And they start recovering the history of slave revolt. And they're like, wait a minute, there were hundreds of revolts, which is true, there were. But when they were writing, at the same time, there was all of this sort of discourse going around. It was like, the war against poverty and instead of talking about like, so the issue was like, why are Black people, having the problems that they have? And it's like, well, it's not because of any kind of structural racism. It's because their gender roles are disformed and pathological, which happened to them in slavery, which created the Black woman as the matriarch, which has never made sense to me. I don't know how an enslaved person, whatever, would be a matriarch. And this Black matriarch emasculates Black men. And, they have these female-headed households, like the idea that you have a female-headed sounds like a Medusa or some kind of monster, right? And so this was like the discourse that was everywhere. Folks are familiar with the Moynihan Report. I mean, this was literally everywhere. And so these historians were pushing back against that. So like in history book after history book after history book, and and of course, Black women didn't engage in slave revolt. They didn't undermine their men by engaging in this masculine behavior. They didn't. So they were like writing strongly against that. This is the same time, you have, the Black Power movement, and you have people like Stokely Carmichael, who was asked, what is the position of the Black woman in the movement? And he says, prone, right? So this is in response to all of this. And then later you get like the sort of the beginning of women's history and feminist history, and women start writing about resistance and slavery, and they're like, okay, if women weren't involved in revolt, they were involved in kind of a lot of day-to-day acts of resistance, and we need to uphold that and honor that. And it was, in fact, more effective. And I'm like, yes, uphold it, honor it, but let's go back and question the original assumption that women weren't involved. And that's where my research project came in. And my dissertation advisor's like, yeah, that's an interesting topic if you want to write about it, but you're not going to find the sources. And, and for me, that's like waving like a red flag in front of a bull. It's like, yeah, I will find the sources, And so,
for any historian, I bet.
Yeah, and I did, it's not that hard to prove. What is that? Like when a negative or what is it? Disprove a negative? When they're like, this didn't happen. You just need to find some examples. And then also looking at the way historians structure their research, they have these blind spots, problems within the primary sources themselves that also, but women were all over the primary sources that I reviewed. So
And there's a question that came into the chat that's directly relevant to what we're talking about. And it says, "Hi, Dr. Hall. I think I heard you mention that the paperback edition coming out is going to include a historiography at the end. Will this context you're describing be a part of that? And for folks who have the hardback edition, will there be a way to access the historiography?" Happy face.
Yeah, good question. I don't see why we can't have it up on the website, you know. Yeah, I mean, it's not a long, detailed thing. I mean, if folks really want to get nerdy with it, they should read my academic article.
Nice.
And so, you know, so there's just a few paragraph explanation, which is what you heard tonight, basically. Yeah.
Awesome. And to kind of switch tack a little bit, I feel like when we tackle a lot of these texts that are like scholarly or have a scholarly basis, there's a way of looking them at like this strictly like, oh, here are my sources sort of way. It's like the hat on academic work. And one of the things I love so much about Wake is that there's these moments of it that are intensely spiritual. And I was wondering if you were willing to talk about that, and in particularly your relationship with your grandmother, who seems to like she shows up in the narrative, and it seems like there's an imprint of her on the book. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and the book was dedicated to her. Mm-hmm. So, you know, so my paternal grandparents were born enslaved. My grandmother, Harriet Thorpe, was born on a plantation in Virginia in 1860. And my grandfather, Haywood Hall, was born on a plantation in Tennessee, same year, 1860. So they were children in 1865 when the 13th Amendment passed. And of course, I never met them. You know, I just turned 59. I don't know anyone who's my age whose grandparents, I'm not talking about great grandparents, grandparents were born enslaved. But the fact that it's even possible, I think, is an important reminder for folks that this is not some kind of ancient history. This is 2 generations away. I wasn't expecting to write about my grandmother in this book. You know, a lot of stuff didn't happen that I didn't expect, like most of it. But she was really important for me in the process of writing my dissertation, because, you know, this is very heavy stuff and it can get really dark spending a lot of time with these materials. And the fact that I was focusing on revolt and resistance helped lighten things up, because, you know, for my mental health, I learned that I couldn't just study slavery. I need to study slave resistance. I was just going to lose but even that can be, you know, it can be rough. And so I actually was ready to just pack it in, you know, and I kind of had this moment where I talk about in Wake, but, you know, it happened when I was actually writing my dissertation and doing the research for it, where, you know, I mean, first of all, I'm like this very logical, rational person who's like an atheist and not very religious or spiritual or whatever. But I kind of like had a conversation with her, you know, like, I wish I could have met you. And, you know, I've thought about her a lot through my whole, you know, childhood and adulthood. My father would tell me endless stories about her. And so basically this process, you know, trying to get sort of in touch with her as my ancestor and as somebody who, you know, who survived this institution and its immediate afterlife. And what I came away from that is that, you know, if she could live in slavery, if she could survive that, I could research it. And it was kind of like a perspective shift for me. Yeah. And so I end up talking about that in the book, and she's actually, you know, her story, or part of her story, is like half a chapter in the book, which I wasn't expecting. And that was all stuff that my father had told me, you know, or that, you know, he wrote an autobiography that was written in, you know, and I did additional research on her, you know, found her obituary and a bunch of other stuff. So Yeah.
Yeah, and it's beautifully woven in these like parts of it which become like family history along with like of course this broader like international history that you're covering in the book.
Hmm.
And one of our partners from Sema Hadithi Foundation wanted to bring up that something that struck him personally was the conversation between the father and son and the conflict of getting a job versus following your dream. And I believe this is the part of the book where your family is going through the Great Migration. And he says, this is literally a conversation my dad and I had. And he asked, what was your reason for adding that to the story?
Well, that was literally a conversation that was had in my family that my father recounted to me. It was a conversation between my grandfather and my uncle, my father's oldest brother, where, he wanted to be an architect. And, I mean, what black man is like, wants to be an architect in the late teens, Um, and, my grandfather was like, that's ridiculous. You're basically your highest aspiration should be work at the post office. Like that's a good place. So yeah, I mean, that's a conversation that happened.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's these moments where you're like vulnerable enough to bring in like your own family history and even like your own partner and a child that y'all are raising that like really, and I do feel like it's also necessary because one of the challenges of books like this is that, yeah, they're very heavy. Like in order to like survive, like even studying the history. I know many grad students who have tried to and have lost their minds and have had to drop out essentially.
Really? Wow.
Um, and one of my favorite pages in the book is the cover image of chapter 5. And it's because you're there resting on the beach with your partner during a much needed break. And then you invoke Audrey Lorde verbally and you have Ursula Le Guin present visually.
Yes.
And yeah, and Audrey Lorde's riddled throughout the text, of course, but can you talk about the impact these two monumental women had on your thinking and perhaps the shaping of this narrative? I feel like when you're, especially if you're drawing things out, like the choice of what you decide to put in is like it seems very intentional for me. So I'm curious, yes, why those two
everything
figures?
everything was 1,000% intentional. I remember with this page in particular, Hugo, like our process would be like, I would write the script, and for a page, and I would be like, and I want your illustration to reflect these things or be composed in this way. And this page was funny because, he penciled it, a couple of times, and I'm like, no, Hugo, I want everyone to see that I'm reading Ursula Le Guin, A Wizard of Earthsea. Like, I don't want it to be like, he's like, okay, send me a picture of the cover of that book. And, so I did that. But yeah, I mean, I wanted folks to have a sense of, what I did when I was taking time for myself. And I love science fiction and fantasy. So Ursula Le Guin, she has a whole shelf just dedicated to her in my house, like bow down to her. And yeah, and the child we're raising, he's now 24. So yeah, no, and we've been together 32 years now. So it was a trip.
And I guess just for what it's worth, I wanted to thank you for modeling that like healthy relationship and trying to build a healthy relationship to this work because it does burn a lot of people out, especially if you're like a graduate student or a professor in academia. I'm going to move on over to a question that's in the chat. Many remnants of the economic system's chattel slavery has reproduced a lot of systemic violence on Black women, which has affected us socially, politically, and economically. What have you seen from your historical research that demonstrates clear examples of this exploitation, violence, and oppression in the social reproduction of Black women in the US?
Yeah. So that could be like, hours. But let me just point to one thing, which I'm actually also writing for the back matter of the paperback. I originally went from practicing law back to the study of history because I wanted to understand how the legacy of slavery was shaping our existence as Black people and as Black women in particular. And so what what I found was I was very interested, with my legal background in understanding how the law created the institution of chattel slavery, right? I mean, slavery is a horrible thing. But it's been everywhere. It's like, but chattel slavery was a very unique new thing where, people were literally property. And so, their descendants were property, et cetera. And, the laws of chattel slavery were kind of instantiated around this early colonial period where the book focuses. And, it became a status that was heritable through the mother. Which was a kind of inverse of the normal common law inheritance threat, which is through the father, right? And what it did was it created basically like two genders of women, white women who give birth to heirs of property and Black women who give birth to property. And, you can't give birth to property and still be considered human, right? It's a kind of a subhuman status. And that subhuman status, I mean, we haven't had any reconciliation, any, way of, addressing this history. And so all of this still just remains and it's constantly impacting our existence. And so, in my law practices, I discuss in the book, I like Black women were getting like half the monetary awards that my white women plaintiffs were getting for the exact same case, exact same facts. And this idea that, Black women are somehow less damageable, less sort of sensate, less, there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson I put in the conclusion that also kind of speaks to this understanding. So, I feel like I came to understand all too well a lot of the origins for misogynoir and also racialized gender, specifically with relation to white versus Black, which has also had a really big impact on creating a very racialized country. So I feel like it impacts the racialization of other folks as well. I mean, I think, indigenous land theft and chattel slavery were both, things that have shaped the United States in these very profound ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And I feel like that question brings me to this other question, which is a conversation that's happening nationally right now, which is a conversation about critical race theory. And I'm curious, yes, how critical race theory plays into Wake, as well as what you feel like is commonly misunderstood or misconceptions that are happening in the national conversation.
Deep sigh. So, I've actually taught critical race theory. I taught it at UC Berkeley School of Law. I taught it at the University of Utah School of Law. I don't even know. I mean, okay, quick one sentence. Critical race theory, was an inquiry started by law professors trying to understand why racism and structural racism remained so strongly despite a whole civil rights movement. So that was the inquiry. And then looking at the ways in which the legal system is intertwined and implicated in, race and racial formations and whatever. It's very specialized, and has nothing to do with what. So there's this kind of underlying misunderstanding about what critical race theory is, but frankly, that's not the issue. And I don't put any energy into trying to correct people about what is what, because the real issue, because I feel like there's this way that the ultra right, keeps setting the terms of the discourse, and then we spend all this time trying to correct them. And then we're engaged in this debate saying things like, but it's not critical race theory. It's like, no, call it all critical race theory. I don't care what you call it. Just, frankly, what it is, this thing that happens. It's this I call it white lash. It's this pattern that happens in US history when there's a sense that a group of people who aren't white are making any kind of progress then there's this violent reaction. We see it over and over again, and we're in one of those periods now. And that's what's at stake. I mean, I really feel like, you know, these ultra conservative white supremacists, I mean, they're really terrified about being replaced, right? That's their thing, right? They're like, you're trying to replace us, and frankly, they're becoming a minority just demographically. So that must be scary for them. But I think, so that's kind of, that's what's sort of fueling this. And so having debates about, is this critical race theory or is it not? I just think that's not even relevant. You know, what is relevant is they banned Mouse by Art Spiegelman in one of the school districts in Tennessee. I mean, this is terrifying. And, you know, and these states are passing law. Utah is one of them, you know, that's passing these laws where you can't teach critical race theory, which literally means anything that they decide it is. And then, and it's about white comfortability, right? They claim it's about like, we don't want any students to be taught to feel uncomfortable about race. But it's like, what you mean is you don't want white students to feel uncomfortable about race, because ignoring all this makes everybody else uncomfortable, you know? So it's just white supremacy. That's what it is. Let's call it what it is. And, you know, yeah.
Yeah. And can you talk about your own experience as a teacher and educator? And I feel like your perspective in this particular kind of arena is super valuable, because you're bringing the PhD history, also the law. So you saw how the law works and all of that, alongside having your experience as a teacher. And you've mentioned and alluded to working both in public schools and different universities and experiencing these racist firings. If you were willing to talk about any of those and open up about them, I'm sure like we'd be really curious to hear.
Yeah, I feel like I don't want to take a bunch of time doing that, but I do want to say that an audio drama is being created about Wake, and it's actually kind of the prequel to Wake, and it documents, like, it talks about each racist firing that I experienced. But
so it's coming.
It's coming in June. Yeah, Audible. So yeah, I don't particularly want to focus on that, but it really had everything to do with, you know, teaching race in the most magnanimous way I possibly could, you know, really both sides saying everything, and, you know, but yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that work. It's some of the hardest work that folks are doing in the school system right now. The teachers out there, we feel you if you're trying to teach subjects that, you know, people have all these tense feelings about.
Well, and they're going to get fired. They're getting fired for doing it. It's not just like tense feelings. It's like, yeah, it's like, you know, McCarthyism again. It's, you know, it's terrifying. And for me, who's, you know, been fired, and I removed myself from this, I had the privilege to remove, when I was a supportive partner, just like I'm pulling myself out of this entire system. But now it feels like when all this is happening, I feel like I'm like in the front row eating popcorn, just watching it happen, you know? So
I bet that's a relief after being on the front lines of it. But yeah, of the friends I have, that's a real fear they talk about. There's certain words they just aren't allowed to say in a classroom, and not being allowed to say those can complicate things a lot. Early on, you say when you think of New York City, your first thought probably isn't slavery, and then you go on to reveal how New York has been built by slavery and things like that. And I'm wondering whether that's something we can say about Utah. When we think of Salt Lake City or Utah at large, our first thought probably isn't slavery. But what do you know about Utah's relationship to slavery, as to kind of bring that conversation to where we are right now in this state?
Yeah, shout out to Dixie State. Yeah. But no, I think so. I mean, Utah, or a large portion of Utah, belonged to Mexico, right? And then it was taken by the United States. I'm pretty sure slavery was legal here. I don't think it was a huge institution, just demographically speaking. So I'm probably not the one to ask. I'm sure there are other scholars in the audience who've done much more work on the issue of slavery in Utah.
Yeah, one thing that Sema Hadithi has let me know, just from being in relationship with them, and they're some of the partners for this event, is that the first scouts that were sent out from the Mormon settlement that was coming and traveling across and migrating across included black enslaved black men who came in and scouted the area first. So before Brigham Young even said this is the place, there was black men scouting the area, and doing that work. Which is something that Robert and the family over at Sema Hadithi would be able to talk a lot more about that legacy and history there. We have a ton of questions that have come into chat, so I'll try to keep up with them right now.
I think also it would be good to show a couple of the images so that I can talk about a little bit about the process of a graphic narrative and what it allowed me to do that other methodologies, other mediums don't allow. So do you have the 2-page spread that I sent you? Are you able to pull that up?
I do. And let's do this. I'll read you one question as I'm pulling that up and getting it pretty on the screen, and then we'll kind of go from there. So I'll read a question that is the one right up here. Do you feel that hidden history of the historically oppressed Black woman in the United States is a deliberate to understanding the real roots of U.S. history? And even further, because if we as a Black community knew about the revolutionary power we had, such as women revolting on these slave ships, then we would be stirring up more pushback against the systems that oppress us. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks for asking that. I think one of the things during the uprisings that happened across the country, across the planet in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, there was this, famous photo of a young woman wearing a t-shirt that said, "This is not my ancestors' uprising," kind of like meaning like we're serious this time, and it just made me feel really sad because I'm like, if she had been taught her ancestors' history, she would be proud of them and be able to draw on their incredible strength and resistance and resilience. And the fact that history is sanitized and resistance isn't taught, is a really deep disservice. And it's also, not surprising. It's, we get taught this very sort of sanitized and inaccurate history of how social change happens, like here it is, Black History Month, thanks Willie for talking about the Black Future Year. I appreciate that. But, Martin Luther King had a dream, like, he had a bean or a cream or a tea. It doesn't even matter. It's like, people haven't sat down and listened to that entire incredible speech. That's all they know. All they know about Rosa Parks is that she was tired and had to sit down. She'd been an activist for decades, and so this whole way in which resistance doesn't exist and history is taught from on high. I mean, don't even get me started about Juneteenth. I am just way not happy about that holiday. And, it's just part of this very paternalistic, we give things to you, you don't take them. And it's very dangerous. And that's why this history is so crucial.
Yeah, there's another question coming in from the chat. Oh wait, I totally set up the screen, so let's make sure to actually do this. I'm gonna go ahead and just share my screen per se, and then there we go. Are you guys seeing the two images together?
Yes, they are together. There's this kind of weird box, but it's not really obscuring the image. So one of the questions that people ask me a lot is, what is it that the graphic narrative medium allows you to do that other mediums don't? And so, if you want to see every frame of something, you go to a movie, right? But this medium in particular is all about arranging, panels and the spaces in between, which we call the gutter, arranging them, in sequences. And it's, there are whole books written on this. But one of the things that was crucial to Wake was putting the past right up against the present. And so in this image, you see me walking through, the street of my hometown, New York. And you see the present and the past completely like up against each other. And that's one of the things I love about this medium. I don't know how I would have done it in another medium, through prose or even in a film. I think it would have been very difficult to do. And I don't know if you have time for this, and you can just say, Dr. Hall, we don't have time for this, but there was an image that I sent you that it shows me researching in the New York Municipal Archives.
I have that pulled up already, so let me flip through and get it.
One,
I got it right here.
Not the full page one, the one that has actual panels.
So not the chapter 4 cover image?
No. It's several panels of me sitting at a table in an archive.
Okay, let me find that one. And I think
it's called Gutter. It's called Gutter.
Okay. While we're waiting for that, we'll drop in one of the questions that have been in the chat, just because, wow, the chat is exploding right now, and I want to make sure the audience has time to engage. But one of the questions that was asked is if at any point you had found any documents that specifically talked about the motivation of the women who led these revolts, and anything in their voices in particular.
Well, yeah, exactly. So no. And, this is a problem when you're researching, the subaltern, when you're researching whoever, people who are at the exact, bottom of the social hierarchy. Exactly. Thank you. And this actually relates to this question as well. You don't have documentation of them speaking for themselves or, what they're motivated. I mean, they didn't write diaries or, it's just, and the people who kept the chronicle of various historical events didn't care either. It wasn't even considered relevant, so here, I'm reviewing the trial record for the trials of the 1712 revolt, a slave revolt in New York City. And, I found, these 4 women who are defendants in the case, Sarah, Abigail, Lily, and Amba. And, I find after searching through these crumbling parchments and, this sentence, like having nothing to say for herself than what she had previously said, she was found guilty and sentenced to burn at the stake or whatever. And I was like, oh, I missed something. And I would go, but they never recorded what she had previously said. And this, it wasn't considered relevant. And that's why, there's a chapter and a half in the 10 chapters of Wake where I engage in what I call a measured use of historical imagination, where I ask those very specific questions. What motivated these women in this time, in this place to do those things? And so I sort of create a story about what they were thinking. And before you pull the screen away, let me just jump back real quickly to this issue of the methodology or the medium of the graphic narrative. So you see, these are panels, right? And then in between the panels is the space that we call the gutter. And the gutter is this very generative space. Like it's there's so much work that it does. It in a way, the reader sort of co-creates the pacing of the book because they're kind of stitching it together, and they're deciding what to, and so you've got this panel gutter. It's kind of like a pacing, and like any other kind of art, like music works this way, other things, you get people comfortable with a relationship, and then you pierce it, and then that creates like, an emotional response. So here you see these images. I talk about this as the shape of absence. So here's an outline of these 4 women, right? And there's nothing in the document, and here their absence is actually pushed through the gutter into the panel on top, which the panel on top happens sequentially before. So this is part of the way the medium works that allows you to do these kind of, these particular types of moves. But just finishing the answer, and you can take that image away if you want, but the answering the question. And so it was really uncomfortable for me as a historian to do this, measured use of historical imagination. It's, but, historians, we construct narratives based on documents. That's what we do, right? And here the documents fell silent, and everything that I do in this chapter and a half, first of all, it's very clearly marked when I'm doing it because I want the process to retain that integrity, but also every single thing, down to the cobblestone, to what plants grew, to what all of it, the oathing ceremony to prepare for this revolt, all of that is drawn from, detailed historical research. I didn't make any of this up. It's all documented, somewhere. Yeah.
And the reason I left this image up is because there's a comment that's speaking a lot to what you had just mentioned about the graphic narrative as a form. This very intentional use of space, gaps, negative space, black ink in opposition to white ink. And there was a question if the form of the graphic narrative, whether it reflected the theoretical and practical work of interacting with archives of Black women in slave revolts, silences, gaps, spaces in and through which Black women sit and speak, thinking of the work of Saadia Hartman and speculative work in gaps of Avery Gordon and hauntings, question marks.
Oh my goodness, who has read everything I read? I love Avery Gordon. And Saadia Hartman, I'm like a fan.
Oh,
and,
she's great.
And if anyone's going to do what I'm trying to do in prose, it'll be Saadia Hartman. She'll have a way to figure that out. But yes, I'm working on, my second graphic narrative project. So Simon & Schuster optioned the second one, on Reconstruction. And I'm just obsessed with developing an explicit Black feminist methodology for recovering our history using the medium of the graphic narrative, drawing on everything, all the authors you just mentioned, and many more besides. But yeah.
Awesome. Friends, we are kind of circling around to the end, so definitely get your last questions in the chat. I have one more I'm going to add, and I see one more question that's in the chat that's unanswered. And my question, it's kind of going off into left field, but one of my favorite parts of the book was when you were talking about the group of African woman warriors. I believe they're called the Ahasi, and I might be pronouncing that wrong. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more of that history, because especially when I think of history that's like denied us, I'm thinking of the Ahasi, and it reminds me of like Maza Mengista's The Shadow King, where they talk about like women warriors who were involved in the Ethiopian resistance against the Italian during World War II. And like, mind you, I think somebody dropped in the chat that the Holocaust isn't taught in schools in Utah. I'm not sure how true that is. I remember learning the Holocaust, and I was raised in Utah. I'm sure that there's some schools that don't do it and some schools that do. But in any case, when I was taught the Holocaust, we weren't taught about what happened to Africa. And that was like a huge part of it, this Ethiopian resistance against the Italians. And I'm curious if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the Ahasi, just because they're freaking cool.
Yeah, well, and first of all, let's just make it really clear. I've taught high school in Utah. The Holocaust is a required core curriculum. I also feel like the history of the Holocaust has been a deep disservice, because the history of Jewish people's resistance in the face of this horrific genocide is just now being uncovered, and, this way that, survivors of the Holocaust are portrayed as these like hapless, people who are almost complicit in what happened to them because they did. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion that we could have. And I have very strong feelings about it. Also, I don't connect the Holocaust to what happened in Ethiopia. I mean, the wars, it was certainly part of the same war. But anyway, now I'm forgetting the original. Oh yes, the Ahasi. Yeah. So, these were the Dahomey kingdom, nation state. These are Fon speakers. This exists in what is now the country of Benin. They had all women's armies. their king, the leopard, fielded, there's documentation of 10,000 women who were fielded as soldiers, and sort of why that happens. Is there some complex things related to kinship and power, and why this was like a better solution than other things to retain the king's power. But there's also a very developed martial tradition in, West and West Central Africa, which is what I study. And Black Panther, for example, where they, where they kind of draw a little bit on this, but it's a complicated history. These, the Dahomey, like all, at this point in the slave trade, when it was like trade or be traded, we're talking about the 1700s now, where 80% of the trade happened then, and things had shifted so dramatically that it literally was trade or be traded. The Dahomey kingdom and its military were, attacking other kingdoms to, make war captives to get involved in. So, it's not like Denai Guerrera and like, yay, but it's also not like horrible. It's like, this is a complex history. But but this military tradition is just fascinating. And there's a lot of documentation about it too. There were European travel writers who were, of course, fascinated. And, even though when the French colonized the area in the late 1800s, there were tons of photographs taken. And yeah, it's really fascinating.
So there's a lot to dig into there for those who are curious, and I bet a lot of other material that folks can be inspired by. I have two more questions for you. One of them is potentially a little meatier. I don't know, because I'm unfamiliar with the illusion that's being made. And then one of them is like almost a yes or no. So we'll start with the little meatier one, which is, do you see any correlations between your wake work and the work of Christina Sharp's In the Wake?
Oh, absolutely. This is a very literary group you got here. Yeah. So yeah, Christina Sharp talks about something called wake work, which is really, it's complicated, but part of it is about honoring the dead, as in a wake, right? And this idea, Christina Sharp, is a brilliant thinker, and she's also engaged with a group of scholars that are trying to think about wake and wake work, and what does that look like? Saidiya Hartman, I think it can be attributed the concept of the afterlife of slavery and living in the afterlife of slavery. And the word wake, and I'm finding this now because it's been picked up in 7 other languages. It's actively being translated, German, French, Spanish, Turkish, Korean, Japanese, and I'm forgetting one. But there's just no wake word equivalent. So because the wake has all these multiple valences, right? The wake of a funeral, the wake of a ship, slave ship in this case, in the wake of something that's impacting you. So
wait, so there's a wake that's related to ships?
Yeah, like a wake of a ship.
Oh, what's the wake of a ship? I had no idea.
It's the path that's behind the ship. It's called the wake of the ship.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And we actually, Hugo and I, oh my God, we spent like 40 hours at least just trying to design this one page. I'm going to try to hold it up for folks. Can you see that? So where I'm
going to put you on speaker view so it's bigger for folks too.
Where we use the waves from the wake as the gutters to create the gutter and panel. So yes, wake of a ship. That is, yeah. So it has all these meanings that are very resonant with this particular topic. Yeah.
Incredible. In the course of answering that question, you answered the yes or no question, which was, is this being translated? And the answer is yes, into an abundant amount of languages and hopefully many more in the future. Dr. Rebecca Hall, you've been very incredible, very generous. We're going to be waiting with bated breath for that audio drama that's going to come out in June. Where do we look for that? Should we just like be refreshing your website every day in June, or like what's going to happen there?
Well, Audible is putting it out. And we're just finishing the script now, and they got a composer. So it's an audio drama, right? You can't do an audio book of a graphic novel, right? I mean, it's like a full-on drama, you know, with Foley sounds being created. I mean, it's just insane. I'm just like, wow, what is this, you know? So yeah, I mean, I guess look for it in June. See, now I'm curious. I don't normally look at chats when I'm doing these talks because it's distracting, but this is a really, really advanced audience here.
And the literary allusions, you can thank Melody Jackson for in particular.
Okay,
there was quite a few that were coming from her. Sema Hadithi dropped some of those as well too, I think. But like, Melody Jackson, if we could give a round of applause to her as well, apparently.
All right. Yeah, there was. I mean, what we got: Avery Gordon, we got Saidiya Hartman, we got Christina Sharp. I just saw a whole bunch more. And you know what usually happens is like when I leave these chats, I'm like, bye, and then I don't ever see the chat or the person moderating ever again, you know. So I was just taking a quick look. But
yeah, Melody says they're a grad student who has been reading all these texts for their comp exam. So
nice.
Definitely probably a lot that they're relating to as they're digging through the graphic novel as well.
Yeah.